Hey guys, SimCoder here, and today we are going to move on our TikTok series, but we are going to do something that's a bit different and something that's really different from everything that I've ever done in this YouTube channel. In this video, we are going to focus on building a back office tool using Retool for our TikTok clone series. So for this, I partnered up with Retool to bring you this video, and the reason why I chose to accept this offer is because I truly believe in their product and because I've used their product in the past. So if you go through my backlog of videos, you'll realize that I don't really accept any partnership, and it isn't because of a lack of offers that come from different companies. It is because I believe that in the position that I'm currently in, I truly have to narrow down on the partnerships that I take to only show you the tools and items and products, whatever, that I really do believe in. And Retool is one of those. So let's do it. And in this video, we'll learn how to implement a user management system with absolutely zero code, which is an amazing thing to have, especially in the current environment that we are on, where we want to publish apps faster and faster. So we have to put a lot of focus into the app itself and not into back office tools. If you are enjoying this series thus far, then please do leave it a like and a subscribe. And yeah, let's do it. Okay, so let's get started. And the first thing that we have to do is obviously to go into Retool's website. In here, you'll find a lot of information about Retool and what it is and what it does. However, we are going to take the more practical approach and actually try and build, or better yet, start building our back office tool. And in this video, again, we'll focus on user management. So we are going to focus on listing users. We are going to focus on viewing the data of those users. We'll focus on updating the users and finally deleting users. So we are going to go through all of the things that you have to do in order to get that part set and done. The first thing that we have to do is obviously sign in. So I'm going to start with an empty account and show you all of the steps needed. And in here, we are going to sign up because I don't have the account yet. So let's do sign up with Google. Now you are thrown all of these forms in order to let Retool know how familiar you are with the app, but I'm going simply to skip ahead of that. So in here, you'll choose the link for your back office tool. So I'm going to call it SimCoder TikTok or something like that. Yeah, that looks good. Let's get started. And you are prompted to start with a template from Retool. However, I want to start from scratch. So let's go ahead and click it. And in here, you'll get the first component that's created whenever you create a project with Retool. It will give you some hints and you can go through them. However, I'll explain to you further up next. So I'm going to skip over them. So let's go continue. Got it. Okay. So this is our main framework. However, before we even carry on, one thing that I want to do is to connect our Retool admin page with our Firestore database, or better yet, our Firebase project as a whole, because we also have to manage our Firebase authentication. So in here, connect resource will appear, so let's do it. Connect a resource, and in here you are able to see all of the things that have a direct setup process with Retool. It has a ton of things. However, we are just going to focus on Firebase. So let's open that up. And now you are able to set all of this data that will associate your Retool account with your Firebase project. So in this case, I'm going to call it TikTok staging. And now we need Firebase database URL, Firestore project ID, and a private key. The name doesn't have to be associated with Firestore. This is just so that you can quickly figure out what this resource is, because you can have multiple resources. So if you have a prod Firebase project and a staging Firebase project, you can have both of them and iterate through them whenever you need to. So either use one or the other, which is really cool and a really good feature to have. So let's go into our project. In here, we are in the Firestore, but I want to go into settings because we'll need some information from here. So the first thing that we'll need is the database URL. So let's grab it and paste it in here. Even though we are not going to use it, as this is meant for the real-time database, we want to use just Firestore. Then for Firestore, we just need the project ID. So let's grab that, paste it in here. And now you'll see that we need the private key. And how can you get this private key? Well, first of all, a private key is basically a service account, which will allow Retool to do all of the things that an admin account should be able to. So an admin account should have admin access to the database. And it will help you to give access to an external service like Retool so that it can actually make changes to the database. So in here, we are going to scroll down and generate a new private key. It will start downloading. And when you open it, I'm going to open it on VS Code. I'm going to grab all of the contents that are inside there, and I'm going to paste it in here. So now what we have to do is, first of all, test the connection, just make sure it succeeds. If not, then you probably paste the wrong ID or database URL into here. So make sure the connection is a success. Then create a resource, and there we go. We now have a resource which will appear in here. Well, now that we have our resource, let's go through each and every single pane that appears in here. You have the left one, the right one, and the bottom one, and figure out what they mean. Well, first of all, let's go with the right one, as it is the most straightforward one. In here, you have all of the components that you can use and that are pre-built by Retool in our dashboard. So if you want a text, you can simply drag and drop it in here and alter all of the data in this right panel. If you click outside and you go into another, it will show you the parameters associated with this item or component in here. This is really awesome. However, there's one thing that Retool does that's really cool and that no other tool does, or better yet, almost no other tool does, which is that they give you the ability to have custom components like this one. So in here, you'll see that it looks really similar to a React component. And these will allow you to write custom components whenever you need it, which is good because you never know when you'll need that really specific feature that doesn't exist within the default components. So when you do, then you'll create your own or be able to create your own. For this lesson, I'm not going to focus on this. I'm just going to use the default ones as they offer all of the things that I need in order to have the back office tool and managing our users, as I said in the beginning of the lesson. Then in the left panel, you have all of the information associated with this screen. So you see that you have a bunch of global variables, then you have components and whatnot. So what do they mean? Well, for the queries is something that we'll see later on, but for the components, these are all the components that exist inside of this screen. So we have the table, which is this one, and in here you are able to see all of the variables associated with it. So you can see the entire object and see what each and every single parameter has. Then you have the navigation, which is this header right here, which was auto-generated for us. And you have a welcome text, which is inside here. Then you have the globals, which is everything that's associated with our screen as well, but it contains our current user, which is the user that's currently logged into Retool. It has the URL parameters, which is really important as it contains all of the information of the URL. And you have the viewport, for example, which has the height and the width, because remember, you are building a tool which has to be accessible in a variety of screens, and you can even enable it to show on mobile so that it will work on mobile. But that's something that's really specific, so I'm not going to bother with it in this lesson. Then we jump on to the queries. So the queries appear in here in this left panel, which these left panels just contain general information, and it gives you an easy look into what exists within our screen. However, these queries are in the bottom panel. So in this bottom panel, you are able to control and create queries in order to run them whenever you need it. So right now, I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to delete this Postgres query because we are not going to use it. And I may even delete this entire screen because I want to show you how to do it from scratch. But just know that this is where you'll create our queries. Okay, so I'm going to save it, and I'm going to do so by hitting Control S, and I'm going to go back home. I'm going to hide this welcoming screen because I really don't need it. And in here, you'll see all of the screens that were created for us. I'm going to delete them all. And I'm going to delete them all because I like to use a really specific folder tree in order to keep things organized. So in here, you'll see all of the items that are generated for our project. And the first thing that I'm going to do is to create a new folder, which will be called users. So in this folder users, we leave everything that's associated with users interaction. So listing, updating, everything will be in here. So if I enter it and I create a new blank app, I'm going to call it list. And it will live inside user, so we know that it will list users. So let's create the app. And there you go. It will auto-generate some code for us. I'm not going to worry about this again. I'm going to delete everything, or better yet, I'm going to delete just the query because we'll need the table in order to list the users. So what appears in here? We see that we have a list, we have a bottom panel without any queries, and you see data in here. Well, this data in here was from the query that I just deleted, and it was auto-populating it with it. So you'll see that it gets the query one, and then it gets the data from that query whenever it succeeds. However, I want to create our own because I want to get all of the users that are inside our Firestore database. So I want to get all of the users that appear in here. And right now there aren't that many, it is just one, but I will create some more in a second just so that we can see a list populated. So for that, we come in here and I'm going to create a new resource query. I'm going to choose a different resource because we want to use TikTok staging. And I'm going to come in here and I'm going to set the service that I want to pick from Firebase. So I need Firestore, obviously, and I can choose the action type. So for this case, I want to simply query Firestore so that we can get a list of all users. Then we'll pick the collection that we want. In this case, I want to choose from the collection called users, and it automatically finds the collections that we have in our root of our Firestore database. Then in here, I don't want to do anything. I just want to list so that we can see what happens. Then with this query, you are able to preview or save and run. Preview doesn't inject anything into the front end or doesn't trigger an update of this component. It simply shows you what this query will do. So let's run it. And when we do, we see that we get in here query ran successfully and we get a list. So in this case, we just have one user, so the list contains just one object. Let's close that up. So we are getting a list of our users, as easy as that, with just no code whatsoever. So now what we have to do is inject this data that we get from this query in this list. And before even carrying on, I'm going to simply change the name of this query so that it is easier to understand what it does. So I'm going to come in here and say get user list. Save that. And now I'm going to click on table. In here, you'll see that you get the get user list.data, and it automatically updated it, the name, because it was getting from query one. However, when you change the name of a query, it will automatically go through every place that you call that function inside our screen and change the name. And when you hover over data, which is where all of the data, the objects that we get from our request will appear, we'll say that it is undefined. And this is because we have to save and run. So when we do, we see that we get our user that's inside Firestore into our list. And now when we hover over data, it will appear in here. So it is really easy to get all of this data. And then you are able to customize this table in order to show only the information that you are interested in. What we are going to need is to just remove all of the junk that's inside of each and every single user that we don't really need to know about when we are listing it. Remember, we are going to create a page in order to show the information of each and every single user in detail, so this is not relevant. For example, the password hash. Then custom claims also isn't, provider data not, Metadata, tokens valid after time, email verified can go, password salt, and the ID is important, so I'm going to move it to the top and remove this metadata. We also have a UID because, well, when we create a user, a Firebase function is triggered and it dumps all of the information of that user inside of this object. So by hiding all of these, we are able just to keep things really, really simple. And because we have the ID of the document, we can also hide the UID, which is contained inside of this document right in here. So now that we have this, we are able to carry on looking at the data that we can change and the parameters that we can actually use. So as these won't be a selectable list, we are not going to need the user to pick many elements from this list. I'm going to remove the select the first row by default, and I'm going to leave it at that. You are able to really customize it, so you can change the background color to whatever you'd like. So for example, do it like so, but I like to keep it as simple as possible, and maybe change the header background, just make it stand out a bit, and turquoise as always. And yeah, that looks a ton better, so let's go with that. Now that we have this, I'm going to go into our authentication page, and in here I'm going to add a user. So test123@gmail.com, and I'm going to set a password that's really, really secure. So let's save it, going to Firestore, and you'll see that a user was created because of our Firebase trigger, and you get the data in here. So in here, when we save it, and don't forget to save it and reload the page, you'll see that both users will appear. So here we are, we have both users appearing, and we are able to make these a bit larger so a lot of users can be in your app. So it is also good to have these be easily viewable by the admin that's using this back office. And you are able to reload data at any time, which will trigger a rerun of this query. Okay, so now that we have this, what we want to do is to be able to go into a different page and to see and edit the user's information. This is really important, obviously, because you don't want to just display information. You want to actually fetch it and show it in a way where the user can edit it. So for this, what we are going to do is again save it just to make sure everything is secure and go back home. In here, we are going to go into users and create a new blank app. So in this case, it will be single. And single just means that we are simply displaying one single user. So it will be under users single. Then it will create our boilerplate app, and we are going to delete the thing that we have in there, the table and the query, because we are not going to use any of those. Now, in here, what we are going to do, because we want to show information of a user, we have to first pass the ID of the user that we want to see. So that's pretty straightforward, and that's something that we'll do right now. So in here, we'll need another column, which will contain a button, which will allow us to go to this app while passing an ID for this app. So for this, what we are going to do is to go in here and add an action. An action is basically a button that we can have, and when we click it, it does something. So we are going to add a new one. We are going to say that it stays on the left and it automatically appears in here, and you'll get a list of actions that exist, because you can have multiple. You can have more buttons, less buttons, whatever, it doesn't matter. Now I'm going to delete all of these that I created, and I'm going to focus on the action one. So I'm going to call it details. So when you open it, you expect to go into a different page where the user's information is displayed, and I'm going to choose open another Retool page. So you can run a query which will trigger, for example, if you want to get the user list again, I don't know, something like that, open a web page, whatever. This could be, for example, to open up the user's profile image or something like that. But for now, I just want to open another Retool page. Then you are able to set which page from Retool will open up when you actually click the button. So I'm going to open users/single. Let's click it, and if it doesn't appear, try saving it and reloading the page so that it shows it in the menu, because, well, we created a page after creating this page, so it might not have that information yet. Then we are able to pass along the data that we want. So I want to pass a parameter called ID with the value of these rows ID. So how can we do that? Well, we can do that pretty straightforward by coming in here and opening up two curly brackets, two sets of curly brackets, and saying table1 dot selected row dot data dot ID. And why am I doing this? Let's take these apart. Well, table1 is the name of this table. So you get then the selected row, which we'll see how we can get. Then it gets the data of that selected row, and then it gets the ID of that row. However, you might say, well, and what if these row is selected and we click on the details of the first user? Well, that's no problem because we have this select row on click. So whenever you click it, it automatically selects that row and then sends it over to the next page. So if we have this row selected, which doesn't really mean anything because we are not using the selected rows for anything other than to figure out the ID when we click details, then if we click on the first user and click details, it will automatically select this row, the first row, and send that data to the next page. So now that we have this action working, and we can, for example, set open in a new tab so that we don't lose the page that we were on when we left this one, and we come in here and click details on the first one, you'll see that this CS9, whatever, this ID will appear in the parameters of the URL. So let's open that up, and yeah, we get CS9HB, which was that user's ID. So it is working. Now what we have to do is figure out how we can receive it on this side. So now we are able to actually get the user's information and all of that. However, I don't want just to get the user's info, I want to get the posts of the user. I want to see what post did this user create to see if I want to ban him or not, for example. So in order to do that, and in order to display the data in a meaningful way and in the easiest way possible for the back office admin user to actually use this app and want to use this app, we are going to go into the components page and figure out what's the best way of organizing it. You have a bunch of components, as I've said before, default components which Retool has created for us so that we don't need to actually write any code. And I'm going to pick tabs. So why am I picking the tabs one? I'm picking the tabs one because we can move between, for example, in the first tab, we have the user info, and in the second tab, we have the posts that the user has created. It is really important to keep an admin page organized, and it is something that I want you to really focus on. So the first one will have the details, and when we change these tab names, you'll see that it changes directly in here. So it is basically an array which contains strings, and each string is a different tab, which you can do a number of things with it. So each and every single tab will be treated as like a new screen. So it can be completely independent of each other, and you are able to drag components onto them without any issues. So the second page or the second tab will be posts, and there we go. Now in here we are able to choose the position that the tabs appear in. So whenever I drag one on top of the other, it will change how it displays the information. We are able to set the selected tab index and whatnot. So you are able to do a bunch of things with it. However, I want to really focus on how to display a form for the admin user to edit data of any user if it feels like it. So for this, I'm going to click outside of the box and search for a JSON schema form, which is something that's really useful as well. In Firestore, the data that we get is a JSON. So if you have a component that receives that data directly without having to worry about parsing the data and whatnot, then it is really, really awesome. So let's grab this JSON schema form, drop it in here, and you'll see that it gets auto-populated. So let's first resize this a bit. So when we click on this JSON schema form, you see that it gets the data from somewhere, and you are able to see the data in here. So you are able to define the schema, so you can define each and every single parameter, what type of data should it have. You are able to see the properties which basically contain each and every single element that we have in here. So we have 3 edit boxes which contain the string with the title, username for the first one, then the password and whatnot. However, this is not where you define how it displays within our screen, because you are just defining the types. So if I look into the password, you see that it appears hidden even though it is of the type string. So it is basically the same thing as the username. And you might say, well, it is because of the title. Well, but it isn't. If I change it to AST, it doesn't have anything to do with passwords. Retool doesn't know that this is a password. However, it still treats it like a password. So we have another thing that we have to look into, which is the UI schema. The UI schema is what defines how the properties are displayed. So for example, in the username, we have the empty value, which would be an empty string. Then for the password, we have this really handy tool, which is UI widgets, which will define if this is a password or not, and you are able to define a bunch of things with it. Then we are able to set a hint, which will appear below. So this basically defines how each and every single field will appear in this form and how it looks within our form. We are able to use checkboxes and whatnot, things, everything we can set. So for example, the birthday is a date. So as you can see, when we click it, in here, a date pop-up will appear. So how the data is displayed is chosen in here. The first one simply defines the data and what each value should be, the type and whatnot. Then we have the default form data, which is actually the data that's injected into it. So if I simply choose the username to be SimCoder, you'll see that SimCoder appears. However, we don't want any default data because, well, we are going to inject it using a query. But it would be a real hassle to have to write this JSON by hand, so Retool has a really handy tool on our disposal, and let's make this just a tiny bit bigger and collapse the query panel because we are not going to use it at this moment. We have this generate schema from a database, and it will tell Retool to auto-generate the JSON schema and the UI schema depending on the document that you want to display in here, which is really powerful and comes in handy really quickly. So I want to choose the resource, which will be TikTok staging. The service will be Firestore, obviously, and then we want the Firestore collection. Then it will look into what we have in here, and it will try to define a basic JSON and a basic UI schema that we should be interested in displaying. So in here, we are able to see the JSON that it auto-generates, you are able to see the UI schema that it auto-generates, and we are able to obviously use it. So let's click it. And when you do this, well, this form will appear. And it contains all of the data that we have for our users by default. So let's, first of all, just enlarge this a ton because it is a lot of information. And let's continue to drag it down a bit more. And yeah, we are done. So in here we have all of the information, but again, just like the list, there is information that we are not interested in displaying because we are just dumping all of this information to our Firestore when a user is created. So let's come in here and actually choose what we want the admin to actually be able to edit or not. So we don't want the custom claims. Let's remove that. The UID can stay. The password hash should go. Phone, this is good. Remove tokens valid, remove password salt, and I'm going to remove disabled, metadata, and email verified, and remove this metadata from here as well. So because we have two IDs and because Retool gives us the ID of the document, I'm going to remove the first one, which is this UID. Now, by saving it, clicking done, we get this form, and it is a hell of a lot smaller, so I'm going to simply grab this and drag it to make sure it fits our screen so that it doesn't occupy unnecessary space. So there we go. Now that we have our form, what we are interested in is injecting data of the user inside this form. So for this, we have to create a new query. Let's come in here and choose default resource query. This will be from TikTok staging. Always pick that one as that's the one that we are using. Pick Firestore yet again. Then for the action, we are going to get document by ID. We are going to choose the user collection. And in order to define the document ID, we have to remember what we have in our left panel. So as you might remember from the beginning of the lesson, in here we have all of the information related to this screen, all of it. So in the global section, you'll see that the URL params, which contain the info from the URL. So in here, we see that we are able to get the ID that was passed along from the users list, and we are able to access it. How can we access it? Let's come in here and do 2 curly brackets and say URL params. So the same name that's inside here. Then we can say dot ID and pick one of them. So we have hash, href, and ID. We want just the ID in order to get that document. So let's save it. And before running it and injecting anything into the front end, let's just preview it. Let's run it, and in here we'll be able to get the user's ID. So this is test123@gmail.com. And if you go into the Firestore, you are able to see that these data matches. So awesome. Without any code, we are able to run queries like this, which is awesome. Let's simply resize this a bit. And now let's learn how we can inject the data into our user form. Well, we are going to use this default form data in order to do that. So the default form data is the data of the user when we first open the page. And in order to actually get that data, we are going to, first of all, change the query name. So let's say get user. And in here, we are going to do 2 sets of curly brackets. And we are going to say get user dot data. And when we save it, well, this data will be null. So when we look into our query, what we see is that in here we have a dropdown which says run query only when manually triggered. And when we click it, we see that we have two options. So we have manually triggered and run query automatically when inputs change. This is the one that we want in here. So anytime any input changes within our form, we want to run an update of the query. So for inputs, in this case, it will be when the page loads and we actually get the ID. So it will run it then. If we wanted to choose run query only when manually triggered, this would be, for example, when we want to click a button and that button does an action within our database. But right now we want to get this information as fast as possible when this component opens. So let's save this, it will run, and you see that we have some errors in here. So let's figure out what's happening. Well, first of all, it is saying that photo URL should be a string, photo number should be a string, provider data should be a string, and display name should be a string. Why does this appear? This is because Retool uses a really good package to handle JSON data. So you can see in here, learn more about how to write the JSON schema here. So let's open up that link. And in here, you'll see the package that they use in order to show this information. So let's go and explore the docs. In here, you are able to see how a JSON schema is defined within this package and how we can actually use this, the data to our advantage. So for example, if we go back in here, we see that photo URL should be a string. Let's first figure out what it is. Well, if you come in here, we see that the photo URL is null. Null for Firestore is different than a string. It is handled completely different. So we have to allow the JSON to accept both a string when we actually inject a URL and a null value. But if you come in here and let's try and find the photo URL, it is the first one, you see that it only contains a string. So how can we actually allow for nulls to also be accepted? Let's go into our JSON schema form and learn how we can do that. So let's go into single fields. And in single fields, we are able to see the field types that we can have within our JSON schema. And we want these types to be nullable if the user wants to. So let's scroll down because it is at the bottom. So nullable types. We can see in here that we can have multiple types per object that we have. So we can have an array of types for each and every single field that we have, which is really good because for things like that, these where you don't know if the data will be null or not, this really comes in handy. So we can have an array which contains a string and a null. And when we save it, you see that the error disappears. Now we just have the phone number, the provider data, and the display name. So for the phone number, it is basically the same thing as it is expecting a string, but it is null within our database, and the error goes away. Then the display name as well. So let's replace this with the array and the arrow goes away. Now we just have the provider data. Let's figure out what the provider data contains. So the provider data is an array which contains multiple provider data if the user is logged in with multiple providers. In this case, we just have one provider within our app, which is sign in with email and password. But if you have Google, Apple, SMS, whatever, you have multiple providers that Firestore has. You can have multiple provider data in here. Multiple entries for this provider data, so multiple elements in this array. And each item contains an object containing data related to that provider. So we have to handle this in some way, shape, or form. So let's come in here and open this up so that it is a bit easier to see. Let's figure out where provider data is. It is in here. So if you looked into the data of the JSON schema, React JSON schema package, you are able to figure out how it does. However, I'm going to show you directly. So first of all, the type will be of the type object, and this type object will contain the title, which will be provider data. So I'm going to skip ahead of that. And in here, we are going to define the items that should be inside of this provider data array. So I'm going to open up 2 points, curly brackets, and I'm going to set the type of the objects the type of the entities that are inside of this array. And in here, I typed in object, it should be array, so I'm sorry about that. Now in here, what we are going to do is to do type and define the type of the items that we have. So we have objects. Then we are able to set the properties. So the properties like so, will be each and every single field that exists inside of this object. So in this case, it will be the email, the provider ID, and the UID. So let's add them in here. And they can be added similarly to what we have up top. So it follows the same logic. So let's grab email, for example. Let's drop it in here, indent it. And first of all, let's just remember what we have. So email. For the email, it is basically the same thing. Then we'll have another, which will be the provider ID, I believe. Yeah. So provider ID, type string, and the title will be provider ID. And finally, we have the UID. So UID, title, UID. Save it, save that. And there we go. We now have our provider data as an object. And the really cool thing, and let's open these up a bit as we have more data right now, is that we can add multiple provider data. So we can add another one and type in the data that we need and choose where it appears within the list. So we can move it up and down however we'd like. I'm going to remove it because, well, I don't want to alter this data. Okay, so one other thing that I want is to show a loading indicator when the query is actually running. And for this, we can come in here into the show loading indicator, make sure you have selected the JSON schema form, and let's do getUser.isFetching. This parameter will be set to true when the query is running and set to false when it is not. When it is true, it will show a loading indicator and it won't let the user to do anything inside of this form. This is just a fail-safe in order to make sure the user doesn't mess with anything before fetching the data. And one thing that's really interesting is that it isn't fetching the data from this ID. So in order to fix this and in order to get the ID that works, I'm going to use UID and move it to that one. So let's do UID, and there we go, the data displays. However, we don't want this data to be editable. So because it is a UID, it has to be unique. So we don't want an admin employee of ours to come in here and mess our database up. So in order to fix this, what we are going to do is to go into the UI schema, into the UID one, and we are going to say UI 2 points disabled, and we are going to set it to true. When we do this, this field will stop being editable by the admin account, and we can't do anything with it other than view it. And you might ask, well, how do I know which parameters I can pass along in here? Well, you can go into the component reference. So in here, you'll see all of the information according to each and every single component that Retool has. So if we go down below into text input, you'll see that we have disable in here. And if you change this data by saying UI 2 points and then the name of the parameter and setting it to something. So this one will be disabled, as easy as that. So now that we have this, what we want to do is to actually make a query in order to save the data to our database and actually update the user's information. So how can we do this? We are going to open up the bottom panel. We are going to add a new resource query. And I'm going to, in here, do update user. Save that. I'm going to choose Firestore yet again. The action type will be update document. The collection will be user. The document ID we'll get from URL parameters as we did before, so ID. And for the value, we'll inject the data that's inside our JSON schema form. So we are going to say JSON schema form.data, and you'll see that when we hover it, it will get all of the data that's currently within our schema. So if I typed in something in here in the email, you'll see that it appears automatically in here. So let's clear that. And there we go. However, we can do some other cool things with this. So in the event handlers, we are able to, on success, for example, show a notification. And when we show the notification, we can say success, the user has been updated. So this will simply show a notification to the user so that the user can get the feedback from the database. So now what we have to do is to associate this query with our submit button. So let's go into our form and let's go down below. And in here, you'll see that we have a submit button. And in order to handle it, we are going to add an event handler. So you'll see that the event type is submit, and we are going to trigger update and query to call up update user. So let's save that, save this. And instead of, well, I don't like the display name of this user, so I'm going to call it SimCoder, and I'm going to hit submit. Let's run it. So it is giving a strange error, and I believe it is because of this schema, which contains two UIDs. And in here, let's check to see if it contains it. So it does not contain any other ID. So let's save this and see if right now it will check out. So let's save and run. And there we go. It has been successful. It was because we had two UIDs, so it was kind of not knowing how to handle it. So let's see if this display name was saved into our Firestore. So let's come in here and try to find display name. And there we go. We have a display name showing. So we successfully updated this user. So right now, let's learn how we can show all of the posts that each user has made. So we want to, for this specific user, which is the only one that has posts, to display these posts because they are that user's posts. Let's come in here. So we are back into our user's single page. Let's go into posts and let's basically do the same thing that we did for listing users. Really, really simple. Let's click outside and let's add a table. Let's make it a bit larger and let's open up the bottom panel in order to add a new query. So resource query, and in here we are going to say get posts by user. So we are going to choose Firestore and the action type will be query Firestore. The collection will be posts. And now we can set a query so that we can only fetch posts that were created by this user. So as you can see, we have a collection which contains all of the posts, no matter the creator, but we have this field creator, which will come in handy right now in order to build this query. So we can say where creator equals to URL params.id, save that. And when we preview this, you'll see that nothing appears. And nothing appears because we are looking into the second user, which doesn't contain any posts. So I'm going to save this, go into our user list, and open up the test3@gmail.com, which is the one that actually has data associated with that user, or better yet, it has posts. So let's open up get posts by user and preview it. And there we go. We have an array with 2 items, which each item contains 1 post created by this user. So this query is working. It is doing what we need. Now all that's left is to actually associate it with this list. So let's come in here, and for data, let's inject the query data. So get post by user dot data. Save that, and all of the posts appear. So we are able to see them. Again, I'm going to organize this a bit just to show only the relevant information. So in here, well, I believe mostly everything is. I'm just going to remove the metadata, and I'm going to organize this a bit. So I want the likes count to be at the bottom and the comment count, and I want the creation date to be also to the end of the list, maybe even the last one. Yeah, that looks good. So there we go. We have another list showing a really specific thing with no code whatsoever. Now I just want to do one final thing, which is to delete a user. So in order to delete a user, because we are using Firebase with Firebase authentication and Firestore, we have to do 2 steps. So first we have to delete the user from Firebase authentication. Then we have to delete the user from Firestore. This is not the way that I prefer to do things. I prefer to simply add a tag to each and every single user saying that it is deleted. This is because you might have dependencies for this user in another collection, so it makes it kind of hard to control it within our front end. However, in order to show you how to do the most complicated thing first, I'm going to show you how to delete a user outright. And with the rules that the EU has implemented over the last years, you have to have ways of deleting a user completely from your database. So it is really important to have this if you want to focus on Europe and to allow Europeans to use your app. So yeah, that's a really big user base, so you should be focusing on that. And I'm not even sure if the US has that as well, but the European Union has, and it contains like 600 million inhabitants, I believe. So yeah, it is really important to have a tool like this. So in order to delete the user, I don't want to just have a button where if the admin user clicks it, it will just delete the user. No, I want to have a model which will tell the admin, like, are you really sure you want to delete this user? This is just to make sure that no mistakes happen. So I want to show a model for that. I want to show a pop-up, an alert. For this, we have this component called model, which is really useful and it does what we need. So I'm going to drop it outside of our tab component just to make sure it is completely separated from everything else. And I'm going to come in here and give it another color. So I'm going to give it a reddish color because it is really, the user should not be touching it. Okay, so now that we have it stand out a bit so that the user know that it is a dangerous route to go in here, we are able to click it and a model will appear. However, it doesn't contain anything. And in order to actually give it something, we can treat it like any other screen. So first of all, I'm going to add a text. And this text is really unique as it allows you to have Markdown inside of our text view, which is really awesome as it allows you to customize text really easily. So when we delete a user, I want to display some information in here. And let's say hashtag, are you sure you want to delete this user? And we are able to center it. And below, I'm going to say this action cannot be, and let's make this bold, reversed. So if you don't know about Markdown, it allows you to customize text like this without having to use HTML with H tags and things like that. So it is really, really cool. And if you are not sure about how to use it, then search around. I'm not going to focus on this, obviously, but it is really easy, and I'm sure that you can handle it. Then I'm going to have two buttons. So the first one will be a big button for the user to cancel this operation. So I'm making it bigger than the delete button, just so that the user can more easily click the cancel button than the delete button. I want to really make sure that the user wants to delete this user. Then for the event handlers of this button, it will be control component. And I'm going to select model, and I'm going to close it. So you are able to do everything that you can with a button, and you are able to control components, so that in this case of the model, you are able to open or close a model. So if I click cancel, it will close it. Let's open it again, click outside, and let's grab yet another button. This button will simply say delete, and I'm going to change the looks of it. So I'm going to change background to white, and I'm going to set the label to red. Okay, and this cancel can be also of blue color, just to seem more attractive. The user has to really want to delete this user. Okay, so now let's learn how we can delete this user. For this, I'm going to close this up, go into the query panel, and add a new one. This one will be called delete user. Let's first of all use the Firebase authentication. So this is the first time that we'll do. Use this, and we are going to delete the user. The user UID will be URL params.id. However, that's not enough, because when this finishes running, we want to trigger another query. And before that, we have to save it. We want to trigger another query which will delete this user from Firestore. Remember, this is a two-step action. And one other thing that you could do is to create a trigger where, with Firebase functions, where whenever a user is deleted from Firebase authentication, the user is automatically deleted from Firestore. So let's do it like so. And in here, I'm going to say delete user from Firestore. Save that. And instead of Firebase authentication, it will be Firestore. So action type will be delete. So we will delete the documents associated with this user, choose the collection user. And in here, I'm going to say URL params.id. Okay, and there we go. However, we want to trigger it right after the delete user is finishes running. So I'm going to add an event handler in here, which on success will trigger the query to delete user from Firestore. And when we save this, it is done. Now going into delete user from Firestore, we want to first close the model, because remember, the model is still open when we do this. So let's do control component, model, and close. But we want to do one other thing, which is to show a notification to the user. So on success, we want to show notification saying success. The user has been deleted. Okay, there we go. I'm going to change the type to success. And there we go, we have it done. However, I don't want to delete this user, as it contains some posts and I want to use it for other lessons in the future. So I'm going to go into the list and try to delete the test123@gmail.com. Let's open up the details of it, come in here, and what I'm going to do is to delete it. So it says open model. So let's change the name first. So delete user. Save that, open up the model and hit delete. And you'll see that nothing changes when we click it. And this is because we didn't tell this button to run any query. So let's add an event handler, trigger query, and delete user. Don't use delete user from Firestore, as that one will run independently. The delete user is the one that calls delete user from Firestore. Okay, so let's give it a quick run, delete. You'll see that this starts running, and it seems like it was successful. However, it didn't appear, the notification didn't appear, and the the model didn't close. However, the user has been deleted and the user doesn't appear in here. So it is working. However, let's check the delete user from Firestore to see what happened. And I believe I reloaded the page before saving. So a newbie mistake. Let's try and do it again. And I'm going to skip over this part while I do what we had previously done. Okay, so I saved the data as it should be, and I added a new user called delete@me.com. Really fitting. So let's go into that page. And before carrying on, one thing that I saw was that, well, we keep on this page when we delete a user, and we want the user to get out of this page when a user is deleted. So I'm going to add yet another event handler in here. So on success, go to app, select the app, and I want to go to the list of users. And I want to not open in a new tab. I want to force the user to exit this page. So these model close and show notifications are a bit irrelevant. However, you can see how it looks. I want to go to a different app to block the user from submitting any information for a user that was just deleted. So let's save it. And now let's go into delete user. And when we delete it, let's see if it exits from here. And it does. It shows the notification either way because it is still in Retool, and the user exits from here. So it is working. Delete me should have been deleted from Firebase authentication. It was, and from Firestore as well, because we should have just one user. So there we go. This is all that I'm going to do today, as this lesson is getting kind of long. However, you are able to now see how powerful a tool like this is, and how easy it is to build an admin page where you can control your content, you can manage users, and do all of that. We'll have one more lesson on Retool, so we'll try to take a deeper dive into Retool. This lesson was really simple, just to give you the basics of Retool, but we'll carry on working with it as well. Again, I really enjoy this tool. Yeah, we have our admin page working. So there we go. We have our user management system working, and we wrote 0 lines of code, which is, again, amazing. And thank you again to Retool for allowing us to do this. So in the next video, we'll carry on using Retool, but this time we'll focus on content management and all of that. So content management of posts and everything that the user can do within our app. So after that, we'll move on and actually start writing some code again. But for the meantime, it is important to get the back office part out of the way and as quickly as possible. And fortunately, Retool allows us to do that. So if you enjoyed this video, then please do leave it a like and a subscribe. And yeah, I hope to see you again tomorrow. Ciao.